I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Welcome to RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. My name is Emma Kami, and I will be your host today. There may be early signs that China may be shifting its strategy and starting to more openly retaliate against the US and its allies for the tech restrictions that they are placing on China and Chinese companies. Here with me today is Matthew Bay, a senior global analyst at RANE. Welcome, Matthew.
Hello, Emma.
What are the early signs that we have seen pointing to that possibility? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that have happened over, I would guess, the last 2 or so months that have been pointing in that direction. The most significant of that was in late March when China announced that it was going to be carrying out a cybersecurity review of the products that are sold in China by Micron, the large U.S. Memory chip maker, and that could, if the cybersecurity review comes out as a negative review on them, could result in China blocking the sales of Micron's memory chips inside of China. That is significant for Micron because Micron sells about 25% of its chips to China. The second major kind of development that we saw was a bit earlier in February when China said that it was going to review a deal between CATL, which is a Chinese electric vehicle battery manufacturer, and Ford, for Ford to use CATL's technology for lithium iron phosphate batteries at a plant that they're an EV battery plant that they're building in Michigan. That's significant because the battery technology industry for EVs is one where China has a stranglehold over a lot of the supply chains and some of the technology. Which is one of the few areas where China has matched the U.S. from an innovation standpoint and is now looking to potentially put into place similar export controls that the U.S. has placed on China in the areas that China has similar type of a dominance, EV battery technology being one potential area.
So what could be playing into China's change in strategy?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things that the ways to look at this in terms of what could be driving China's change in strategy, if this is the start of an actual process. One of those things is just simply a calendar date. One of the things that we have been talking to our clients about since late last year was that China hadn't really retaliated significantly targeting U.S. companies in the tech sector since the U.S. started to put into place very significant restrictions on Chinese tech companies, starting with Huawei about 4 years ago now. And one of the reasons why we suspected that they hadn't done that had been due to their concerns about their own domestic economy and some of the blowback to that. One of those concerns being, of course, the COVID-19 crisis. They wouldn't want to necessarily rock the economic ship during that. And then last year, they had a number of kind of international issues that they were looking at. One of them being when Beijing hosted the Olympics. Another one being when President Xi got his formal third term, christened in October, and then again in March of this year. Those kind of calendar dates would make it seem like China wouldn't want to detract from being having Xi kind of being supported on the international stage or anything like that. But once we got past those calendar dates, if China was going to make a shift, there would be a reason as there was nothing really left that could disrupt that from a optics standpoint. And that's one reason why, at least now, if China wanted to, they wouldn't have to put those into consideration. The second issue is that we've seen over the last 3 months or so is that the United States is starting to get more countries on board with a more harder position against China. French President Macron's statements a few weeks ago that were trying to distance the French position away from the U.S., calling for more strategic autonomy notwithstanding, we did see in January both Japan and the Netherlands reaching an agreement with the United States to put into place some level of export controls on the exports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. That is significant because Japan and the Netherlands are basically the two countries whose companies are main exporters of those technologies outside of the U.S. So if the U.S. can get on board the Netherlands and Japan, that means that China's access to these advanced chips manufacturing equipment, so the actual lithography machines needed for building these chips would become severely restricted and in some cases just simply impossible to get their hands on, which would deepen the impact of U.S. restrictions. Japan and the Netherlands are both in the process of doing that. Japan's kind of unveiled some of the regulations that they want to. The Netherlands is planning to do that by the start of the summer. So there are potentially signs from China's perspective that the U.S. is starting to convince non-U.S. countries to get on board with some of those restrictions, which would then justify China trying to retaliate because as it spreads, that's what China wants to head off. It's one thing if the United States is doing it alone. They probably recognize that it's a foregone conclusion that the U.S. is going to put into place these restrictions. But as the U.S. gets more of its allies on board, that becomes a much more significant threat for China. And by targeting the U.S., and U.S. companies for some of these restrictions, it might be trying to warn other countries that might be considering joining the U.S. from doing so over retribution to their own companies.
Right. So how far is China likely to go then in targeting the U.S. and other Western companies? Or other Western countries, sorry.
Yeah. So yes, I think that China is going to be somewhat surgical in the way that it retaliates. China is probably not going to target a U.S. company or a Western company that it is highly dependent on for its own economic strategy. And what I mean by that is a company that is exporting or operating in China or operating in China that has very significant market sales of a unique product that China cannot access anywhere, whether that be an advanced semiconductor or some sort of another, advanced clean energy technology, whatever it may be. But in the areas of high technology where China has alternatives, those are where the risks are higher. And that's what makes the Micron example kind of unique. The memory chip market is dominated by three companies, SK Hynix, which is a South Korean firm, as well as Samsung, another South Korean firm, and Micron. The three of them combined for about 95% of the global DRAM market for memory chips. And they each have around a third. Micron it has about 25%, so it's not quite a third. But my point being, though, is that China has all alternatives. These are relatively standardized. You can basically, if you're not putting a memory chip that's made by Micron, you can more or less substitute fully a Samsung one, for example. So there are options. So it doesn't really harm China to go after them. However, in some other areas, for example, if they were to target, one of the few sellers of highly advanced equipment for, highly advanced equipment for semiconductors, just to go back to that example, manufacturing, you're talking about two or three companies and in total, and there really isn't a lot of spare capacity. There's not a lot of standardization between different competitors. So that really China's ability to put into place restrictions without harm back to them is less. Outside of the high technology sector, there's a lot more sectors that China could retaliate against. When you think about a lot of Western companies that are active in, say, the Chinese service industry or general apparel or even things like retail space, those are areas where, U.S. companies don't have a unique thing to offer, or Western companies don't have a unique thing to offer. There's plenty of, Chinese competitors to Starbucks, plenty of Chinese competitors even to Apple. So those are the kinds of companies that China might be more willing to target because they don't have the same kind of a blowback effect.
And how do you think the U.S. will react to this?
The U.S. is already starting to react by trying to get South Korea on board with the idea that having SK Hynix and Samsung to not backfill essentially lost potential market share if Micron were to be banned by China. That is something that is probably going to be a tall order, even though the president of South Korea is currently going to be having a visit to the U.S. Because there's a couple of reasons as to why South Korean companies may not want to do that. And the most number one issue is the threats of retaliation against them as well. South Korea's economy is, of course, very tied into the Chinese economy much more than the U.S. And we have seen in the past, China has been willing to effectively put into place bans or boycotts of South Korean firms over South Korea siding too closely with the U.S. on certain policies. The most notable example of this was about 5 or 6 years ago when Lot, a Chinese conglomerate, was donated land, or was handed over land for the deployment of a U.S. ballistic missile defense system in South Korea, then saw a lot of its sites being boycotted in China and also being restricted overall. So there is a past precedent that China has done against South Korea. So that's something else that Seoul will have to consider, as well as the companies Samsung and SK Hynix.
What are some key things to watch out for that could suggest worsened relations between China and the U.S. That could trigger retaliation?
That's a good question. One of the things that I think that is worth bearing in mind is exactly how this review of the Micron case goes. Quite frankly, in China, there's a lot of these cybersecurity reviews that are in many ways just kind of normal, in the sense of that even the U.S. has cybersecurity views on certain technologies. That's not completely unprecedented. The question really is well, does it become an issue? Does China actually follow through with any kind of restrictions? In many cases, they don't. So exactly how that plays out is likely to be one thing, and that how that plays out is also likely going to be a product of not only China's cybersecurity review, but also what the U.S. does on specific Chinese technology over the next few months. There are, for example, on Capitol Hill, lots of calls for the U.S. to force ByteDance to sell its share of TikTok or just ban the app entirely. China has already come out and said that they're against the forced sale of TikTok. So that's an area where the U.S. can put into place restrictions that then China will then retaliate with kind of funding or finding some sort of an excuse with Micron to put restrictions on Micron. The other big thing to be watching over the next few months is the U.S.'s attempt to put into place a review mechanism for outbound investments. That's something that the Biden administration has been trying to do through an executive order, and it's been preparing that for about a year now. We are likely to have that either at the end of this month or into May. And the scope and nature of that executive order and how the U.S. can block investments into China's tech sector could also be an impact on how far China is willing to go when it comes to those restrictions. And then finally, whether or not the South Koreans or, quite frankly, any other G7 country starts to announce similar restrictions or not or promising not to backfill any lost market share, like on the Micron example that I gave you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. You can learn how geopolitical events like this could affect your business with RANE Worldview. Our flagship risk intelligence products provide clients with access to the insights and analyses they need to make more informed decisions and drive better risk management outcomes. Sign up at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emma Kami. Thanks for listening.